When we first meet with the path and meet with our spiritual teacher, when that spiritual friend, when these two responsibilities hook up and they are played out effectively and well, there should be a change. That change is oftentimes, well, in truth, that change is subtle to where it is only possible to really recognize it if one has some accomplishment at recognition, because there is a slight shift. When one meets with a teacher, one meets with another view. We may not adapt it immediately. That may take time, but we meet with another view. A recognition of cause and effect relationships that we may not understand, because we have been engaging in these relationships since time out of mind. The recognition that we may have to let go of some ideas that we compulsively clung to before. And you know that takes time. For instance, the idea that if I'm dissatisfied with the worldly love that I have, let's say, and nobody loves me, or I'm in that kind of frame of mind, nobody loves me. I don't think that people give me enough love. Let's say I have that kind of idea. So upon meeting with a spiritual teacher, you will get the idea that the way to apply the antidote to that is to give more love to others. That's the antidote for that condition, because that condition is brought about by not having given much love sometime in the past. To accept that is difficult because you don't want to give love, you want to get love. You want that mantra, gimme, 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 gimme. But the teacher offers you a different point of view, which is there is another way to apply the antidote, to increase virtue. And that would be the antidote. And this has to be in the same head with the mind that says, no, if I want more love, I have to go out and troll. I have to go out, I have to do the bar scene, I have to go troll, I have to join some clubs, take up a hobby that somebody cute is taking up. I don't know, personal ads, whatever. I don't know what people do nowadays. Pure dumb luck, just walk up and down the streets. People in Sedona do that, I don't know if that's why they're doing it, but they do. They walk up and down the street. So, yeah, well, we got that too. So, with our thinking is that if we just do these ordinary things, we'll get some kind of magical result. And so that the suspension of that kind of ordinary belief is part of a discipline or a commitment that one makes when one meets with the path. We are essentially awakening, moving into a state of recognition. And that requires the realization that we were asleep. You know how it is? Have you ever had one of those funny dream experiences where you think you're awake and you're not? And you can't wake up because you think you're awake and you're not? So, and whenever you think you're awake, you do something in your dream or something happens and then you find that you're still not awake? You know what I'm talking about? Well, we can't approach the Dharma path like that. One of the ways to break the cycle of that kind of dreaming is to learn to understand when you are asleep, to learn to recognize that. And that takes practice and commitment, but it can be done. Now, the way we approach the Dharma path is the same way. We have to allow, and it has to be okay, that the way that we have ascertained information before was through the diluted five senses. We don't have all the facts because we can't see cause and effect relationships that began before this lifetime. So basically, when we come onto the path and we meet, there has to be a sincere effort. The teacher says to you something like, if you want to have more friends and more love in your life and more fulfillment in that way, then apply the antidote. And the antidote would be more generosity, giving rise to the bodhicitta, to great compassion toward others. That's the antidote. And so the part of you that says, nah, the antidote is personal ads in the Arizona Republic. Or the antidote is whatever we've got cooked up. Begging, pleading, anything. So temporarily there has to be this honest, and here's where the purity comes in. Here's where the bowl thing happens. It has to be an honest attempt to hear that without prejudice. You know? And you're not going to get it perfect the first time. But there has to be that attempt. That is a kind of beginning discipline, beginning virtue, that when we approach the path in that way, the results are good. It's just that simple. The results are good, and we want good results. But if we approach the path the other way and saying, well, I hear what you're saying, but my particular situation is different. In that I haven't been to all the bars, and there is still hope. You have to suspend that. It's not like you have to really come down on yourself and hate yourself, or you can go into this big thing, but you have to suspend that with a pure attempt. Pure is what? Pure means like childlike. When a child goes to pretend, goes to play, goes to try something, child tries on his parents' clothes and pretends that he's the parent, right? So when that happens, there is a suspension. The child doesn't stop wearing footsie pajamas at that point. There is a temporary suspension in order to try out. It's childlike. It's a sense of, there's a pure childlikeness about it, a kind of wonderment about trying on this new garment, trying on this role. And so the student, as they enter onto the path, has to have the same kind of temporary suspension and an honest attempt. So many of us enter onto the path kind of like, let me use a physical posture just to show you. It's kind of like, kind of like that. And the sense that we have is that we're a little bit like residing in our appearance right then. We're totally in the ego. We're doing this watch how cool I am thing. I've heard so many teachings that this doesn't impress me. And it's a very external kind of silly. It's a waste. Purely a waste is what it is. It's like going to a continent full of precious jewels and leaving empty-handed when all you had to do was pick one up. You see? It's silly. It's a waste and it's silly. And it says more about you than it does about the teaching, quite frankly. I mean, it really does. So we have this commitment. The teacher and the student come together in a certain way with this idea that there's going to be this offering, and that offering is a pure attempt. So remember, the mind, the heart is like a bowl. You want to make sure that the bowl is not turned over. And you also want to make sure that at the bottom of that bowl is not some leftover poison. And that's the other thing that we should avoid, that we are poisoned with ordinary view and judgment. Non-virtuous judgment. That would be like poison in the bottom of the bowl. So even if you hold the bowl up like this, and the milk of Dharma, the nectar of Dharma is poured in there, it's going to mix with that poison. Now, I'm belaboring this point because Here's what I have found in my own personal experience of teaching others and my own personal experience with practice. And it is this. Entering onto the path and shooting for enlightenment is like taking a rocket and shooting it from the Earth, say, to another planet, to the moon or to Mars. What's really important about that shooting is how exactly you aim. You can't be, when you're even if the moon's going around the Earth and you're aiming for the moon, and at the time you shoot this rocket off the Earth this way, the moon's down there. You've got to time it so perfectly and mathematically, because even the tiniest fraction of a mistake at the point of aiming and shooting that missile, that's going to take the space ship up to whatever planet. The tiniest mistake at that level will make for uncountable distance when we come close to our goal. That's why I'm belaboring this point. The sincerity, purity, and honesty with which we approach is like aiming that rocket well. If it's a hair's breadth off when it's shot, it could be 1,000,000 miles off when it lands. And it's like that with Dharma. I love seeing new students enter onto the path and meeting with new faces, because the first thing that I want to do is say, let's break all our old bad habits. Let's start new and fresh. Hey, there's no time like now. We are not getting younger. And the idea is to enter onto the path to consider that this is a new page, a new leaf, and to consider that it is possible to make this friendship between the spiritual friend and the student, to fit it in perfectly, to make it secure, to not compromise it, so that result will be excellent in the future. And we have that opportunity now. So whenever I meet with new students, this is the approach that I like to take. I like to take a long time building this foundation. So when we enter onto the path, there are many things that change, not only the meeting with the teacher and the meeting with the path, but also our personal goals are going to change. And those personal goals have to be built on understanding. Here are some cautions and some directives that I would like to give out, because I think they are very helpful. Excuse me. Okay. First of all, when we first meet with the path, when we first make that connection, the way to view that is to immediately separate that meeting from ordinary experience. And what I'm describing here is maybe kind of a subtle inner posture. It's like seeing the Dharma, seeing one's teacher, seeing these images that give us support in our practice, seeing all of those. It's as though we should consider that a revelation. Like to say, here, I have met this method that results in enlightenment. And to distinguish between that and the fact that maybe you're going to head out to Bash's to buy dinner after we're done here. Here's the important thing to remember. We have to be able to understand that one thing brings one result and another thing brings another result. it is the appreciation of what that result is, that recognition, that brings the very result. You see? Even if the teacher came and took some picture of the Buddha or maybe the Buddhist text and slammed it into your head many, many times until there was a dent, it's not going to go in. That door only opens from inside. But do you hear what that means? You have every opportunity is owned by you. Every opportunity for recognition is yours now. You own this precious jewel. No one can diminish your effort. No one can diminish your opportunity. You are in the driver's seat. So, upon hearing the teaching, how does one react? How does one hear? How does one register this? To be sitting in a teaching and thinking, oh, I have to go to Bashas because I don't have the vegetables I need for dinner. That's not appropriate. To recognize the difference between the result. And the way that you do that is to make yourself sit there and think about it for a minute. Recognize the result. Dharma results in enlightenment. Vegetables eaten result in... Huh? What, you don't know? So that's the difference. And here we are at this point where we are poised, and it's a very pristine moment. Your job is to keep this moment pristine for all the rest of the time that you are traveling this path. Let it never become mundane. Let it never become ordinary. Let it never become just a thing that you do. These are the Buddhist teachings. Here in America, we have no history that helps us recognize the difference between Buddhist teachings and the ordinary worldly experience. Because we are taught, we should get a good education, we should make lots of money, we should marry someone rich. We have all these ideas, and whether they were put into us very firmly or maybe just absorbed kind of gradually, we still have them. We don't have the history that teaches us how to practice and to maintain this pristine, virtuous, pure moment. So for the Western student, the responsibility is greater. The responsibility is greater. You don't have a culture to fall back on that has the same recognition of virtue that you do. What is that? I thought somebody was playing with toys. I thought, am I speaking a funny language? That's okay. So our responsibility here is to keep that pristine moment awake. We then become bodhisattvas, those who are giving rise to the great compassion, the great bodhicitta. Any display of the Buddha nature, whether it be teachings on the ground of one's being, whether it be the appearance of one's teacher and the connection with that teacher in the world, whether it be Dharma teachings, whatever the experience is, we are taught to hold that in such reverence so that our mind's appreciation, so that our approach and our connection with that teaching is moist. This is the teaching we are told, to keep that pristine moment moist. with the breath of the Dakinis. That is to say, moist with the blessings of the primordial ones, or moist with the awareness that is different from ordinary awareness. And if the path becomes dry and lonely, it is inappropriate to blame it on the path, because the only reason that one can do that is if one has not distinguished at the very beginning, as I'm telling you to do now, the difference between ordinary things that produce ordinary results like loneliness and that which arises from the Buddha nature and results only in enlightenment. In the future, it will give us the wisdom to recognize where discomfort and suffering comes from. And it will give us a better understanding of the cause and effect relationships that can bring about the antidote as well to that suffering. There is a cause for that suffering. There is an antidote that will relieve that suffering. And it's that view, that understanding, that beginning of recognition, so important, that is the building block for the path. To recognize that difference, to give rise to that deeper understanding, is the firm foundation that we have to build on. So when we see the Buddha, that is the images and statues and different artifacts that we don't consider to be, like, how can I say it? An object that we worship. It's not like that. We consider them to be supports for our practice. And when we see the image of the Buddha, we should think, oh, thus I am. Not pridefully. Not like, I'm as good as him. That's a little different from thus is my nature. You see? There's a little bit of difference there. That recognition every time. Even simple things like when you handle teachings, we say you should never lean on a teaching or sit on a teaching or put it underneath you in any way. Not because the teaching is going to get up and bite you in the tuchus. That's not it. Not because the teaching is going to pay you back in some way, but for our sake, so that we can maintain that pristine recognition. Having that, we are also armed. It's like we have, it's like we are spiritual warriors in a sense, because we have armor, and we have weapons against ordinary view and the narcotic of samsaric existence. So we have this kind of armor and these weapons, and they teach us, they help us to be able to distinguish, so that in the future, when maybe you're firmly on the path and you're thinking about, should I take retreat, should I take robes, should I practice as a layperson, you're making all your decisions and you're kind of sorting things out, but you are on the path and have been for some time, you want to make sure that when you make decisions like that and you go more firmly and take further steps into the path, that you are armed with that kind of recognition. That you don't say things like, and this is something that happens to seasoned students. They will say, in the future, they will say, well, I really thought maybe I'd take robes, or I really thought I'd have a Genyan ordination, or I really thought I'd go into this, 3-year retreat, or I really thought that I would go and study with this teacher, something like that. But now I realize that I need more friends, and I'm kind of lonely, and I'm not very happy, and so I better sort that out. I better stay here and try to get happy and hang out here, and maybe I don't want to take robes because I'm just not very happy. So we think like that. Do you hear the befuddled confusion in that? Do you hear how our minds are going round and round like bees in a jar, with no foundation, no way to understand cause and effect? Because in the beginning the student did not say, this cause creates this result, this cause creates this result. They did not practice that recognition. And that's very, very important. Very, very important. It will protect you and guard you and help you to make the right decisions in order to attain your wishes. So, as we are beginning to practice Dharma, and that is the important thing, our own inner posture, the diligence and purity and respect with which we make this connection. And the second most important recognition, and this is extremely important as well, as we give rise to Dharma, or as we enter onto the Dharma path, we are giving rise to a progressively more and more awakened state, depending, of course, on how we are functioning, on how our view is maintaining, and how we are practicing the proper cause and effect relationships. So, when we enter onto the path of Dharma, we become what is called awakening beings. The last time that I taught, I gave the Bodhisattva vow, didn't I? Here? Yeah? Oh, it was Maryland? Sorry. We'll do that soon. One of the first things that one should do entering on the path is to take the Bodhisattva vow. And that vow is a commitment to recognize the condition of samsara, to distinguish between that and the condition of liberation or realization. To realize that the condition of samsara is that it is pervaded with suffering. And that means that all sentient beings are suffering. Now, I actually had some people come up and argue with me about that, which I thought was pretty funny, because they were really suffering. But anyway, they came up to me and argued with me about that. And their idea was, well, it's only suffering if you, some funny thing, it was just like, you could tell it was theoretical, you know. It was like, it's only suffering if you call it suffering, and everything is beautiful. And all these kind of, you know, la 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 la, all this kind of stuff like that, you know. And my response to that was, do you have a mirror? Because you're getting older. And you know what older means? It means die someday. All sentient beings experience aging and death. This isn't a suffering. I think it is. I'm suffering terribly with this. So we all have these sufferings. And the conditions that we're talking about, the need here is to recognize that condition. The person that says, I don't accept that suffering is all pervasive, I don't accept that sentient beings are going through this condition, experience, those beings are very much asleep. Very much asleep. And there is no distinction in their mind between a condition that is difficult and leads to terrible suffering or builds terrible suffering, between that and a condition that alleviates suffering. They cannot recognize giving rise to compassion. So a student, on the other hand, that enters onto the path and begins to practice that recognition between what is extraordinary and what arises from Buddhahood and what is a condition of the world and results in more of the world, that student is going to have a lot of trouble making that distinction. That student well, that student, the other student will have a lot of trouble making that distinction. This student, on the other hand, will have a whole different experience. This student will be able to recognize the difference between these things and will recognize that any appearance of the Buddha, whether it be the ground, the path, or the fruit, any appearance of the Buddha is the appearance of the great bodhicitta, the appearance of the great compassion. And so, as we enter onto the path and give rise to more virtue, we are giving rise to the bodhicitta. We are giving rise to compassion. We don't understand that this is so because we are so used to the ordinary human condition. But in fact, any appearance of the Buddha nature is consistent with the Buddha nature, is inseparable from the Buddha nature, and the bodhicitta, which is the result of the practice of the path, which is the result of giving rise and awakening to that nature, that bodhicitta is as inseparable from the fundamental ground of being as the rays of the sun are to the sun itself. You know that the sun is affecting you. You know that the sun is affecting you, but is the sun down here affecting you? Well, it's the sun's rays that are affecting us, and they are inseparable. You don't have one without the other. And it's like that, the primordial nature of being, that is the Buddha nature, and giving rise to the bodhicitta. This display is the very display of compassion. Inherent in that display, and along with entering onto the path, we are accomplishing, what we have to accomplish is the recognition that all phenomena, that all experience, and all sentient beings that are experience that experience, when you examine it, it is flawed and faulted. In that experience is based on the idea of self-nature being inherently real. And so, like neurotics, we are acting inappropriately according to who we are, to what we are, if you think about it. If in our nature we are the primordial ground of being, which is the Buddha nature, if that is the seed of our nature, we aren't acting like that. We are acting like separate people who want something, who need something, who are going to get something or push something away. And so our entire experience in phenomenal existence is flawed because it is by definition neurotic. What is neuroses? Acting, thinking, perceiving inappropriately to the conditions that are present. Bingo. That's samsara in a nutshell. Non-recognition. That is the neuroses of samsara, and it is all pervasive. Everybody here, everybody that lives, everybody that is a samsaric being, whether it be the lowest worm on the planet or the highest king or queen, we have one thing in common. Well, a couple of things. One of them is we have the same Buddha nature, indistinguishable. Not one is higher than the other. Even though we have thrones, if you wanted a democratic philosophy, you can't get better than this. In our very nature, the lowest worm is like the greatest king. No separation. And so, we have another thing in common. And that other thing is we all wish to be happy. That's the other big thing we have in common. Even people who are acting like they don't want to be happy. Maybe you know somebody who acts in such a way as to make themselves and everybody around them purely miserable. Maybe you have a teenager. Maybe you know somebody who is desperately sad, and the only thing they can think to do about it is grasp and whine and grasp and whine. Maybe you know somebody like that. But you have a lot in common with that person, besides the grasping and whining. And that is that you both wish to be happy. But you have two different understandings of what will make happiness. See, the one person feels that they are alone and they want something, and so their only understanding is to grasp. But having entered onto the path, perhaps you realize that grasping is the cause of suffering, not the antidote to it. So, this is the kind of difference in recognition that we have to deal with. And this is the understanding that as we move on to the path, we have to give rise to, and that is all sentient beings are in their nature the very Lord. And that all sentient beings wish to be happy, and equally so. And that seeing that in their nature they are the very Lord, and that each and every one of them, no matter what their confused activity is, want to be happy. That gives rise to, if we really approach this purely, virtuously, and with some depth, it gives rise to a great compassion. Study anyone, and you can see that someone who genuinely wishes to be happy is creating the causes for their own unhappiness, and no one else is doing it. Whether in seed form or whether they are reaping the result, that's the way it is. Because about phenomena, Lord Buddha has taught us this one thing, that when we give rise to the cause, we are at the same moment giving rise to result. And one of the great faults of cyclic existence is that, in our view, because of our distorted sensory perception, we can't see that cause and effect arise not because of each other, not after each other, but interdependently and simultaneously. We see them separated by time or some kind of distance, even to the point where we can't see the connection between cause and effect, but they arise at the same moment, at the same place. The interdependence of cause and effect is one of the Buddha's basic teachings. So now we look around at all these beings. How are they bad? How are they evil? They're not bad or evil. They are the very Lord, but they are confused and still asleep. And what compassion comes up from that? Like a bird locked in a cage, never to fly. Like a gorgeous creature that lives in some exotic land, kept in a toilet or a sewer. How horrible, how unthinkable that all sentient beings are what they are and are wandering in confusion like that. And so we enter onto the path with a certain determination. Now from this point forward, having met with the teacher, having met with the path, having heard the primary instruction, how to set my mind in the right way, now I examine samsara and I see for myself, I have the tools and this is unacceptable. It is unacceptable to pick up the paper and read how much suffering there is every day. It is unacceptable to hear about a friend who you think about in love and now has some terrible disease, or it is unacceptable to think that you're doing fine and then you find out that you yourself have some terrible disease. These are the kinds of sufferings that are part of life. Now, understanding what we understand, that we are all equal, that the Buddha has taught the equality of all that lives, and that all we wish is to be happy, and that we have that right. Now entering on the path, it becomes unacceptable for there to be any other choice. Now is the time to give rise to that great concern for all beings. Now we should examine samsara and see that everything ends and is impermanent. To see that non-virtuous activity always results in more suffering, whether we know it or not. And to see that virtuous activity results in a lessening of suffering. But it's so sad we don't know how to practice that because we haven't been taught, most of us, and the connection is not made. To recognize this and see that this is the condition of samsara. At this point, we give rise to the great compassion and we say, thus I will practice for the sake of sentient beings. Because now my own liberation and relief, and the liberation and relief of others, these two become equal and non-dual. There is no progress on the path without giving rise to the great bodhicitta, the great compassion. There is no progress on the path when one holds oneself up above others and does not consider the equality of all that lives. To play spiritual, to act spiritual, to be like a little junior guru, or to have your own little spiritual thing, or whatever it is, to approach the path with anything less than virtue, purity, and humility is obscene. Because while we play our little games, all sentient beings continue to suffer. Each and every Dharma teacher is dramatically interested in the progress of each and every one of their students. And this is how to understand the bigness of the samsara condition. Definitely the teacher cares about the progress of the student because your suffering, because your enlightenment and my enlightenment are equally important to me. You see, that recognition. So the student and the teacher finds the student to be precious and important as their own nature. But what's even more important is this. All sentient beings, as the Buddha has taught, have within them the seed of enlightenment, the seed of Buddha, the Buddha seed, the nectar that is our nature. But not all sentient beings have yet, even though we have existed since time out of mind, not all sentient beings have yet created the connection with the Dharma, the path, which means they are not in a state of recognition and they don't have the connecting awarenesses. So that being the case, I am not only interested in your progress, but I am interested in all sentient beings who have hopes of you. Because there are many sentient beings that you are connected with, and I am not. I have not met them, I have not connected with them, but you have. And so maybe they have no direct connection with the Dharma or a teacher, but someday you will have result on your path. You will attain perfections. You will achieve these distinctions. And when that time comes, they who have that Buddha seed, but no other connection with the path besides you, their hopes on that day will be fulfilled. And so that is the hope of every teacher, that each one will awaken, ripen and awaken and accomplish Dharma so thoroughly that they in turn can end the suffering of all sentient beings. And when we enter onto the path, we should never do so only for ourselves, thinking, oh, I would like this, or oh, liberation sounds good, or oh, I'm suffering too much. The first and most important step, other than recognition, is the continuation of recognition to the degree that having recognized the Buddha in all things, it now becomes the case that our salvation and the salvation of all beings become indistinguishable and equally important. And so the bodhisattvas say, I will not cross the line into Buddhahood. I will not abandon the world. I will stay behind and I will appear life after life after life until all are free. And the bodhisattvas make the commitment, may I be the last to cross over. May I see their feet as they walk through the door of liberation. And this is the hope of the true practitioner. And I hope that as you enter the path, you will begin to accomplish these recognitions and move into a place of true generosity and true compassion, recognizing all sentient beings not in the way the world recognizes them, high and low, dark and light, tall and short. That's the way the world recognizes things. Our first step is to recognize the equality of all that lives in their nature. In their nature, they are the very Lord. So that is our teaching for today.